Imagine two cities burning. Not just burning, but consumed, erased, obliterated by fire that came from above. The kind of destruction so complete that thousands of years later, people still can't quite believe it was real. The story shows up everywhere. In the Bible, obviously. Everyone knows about Sodom and Gomorrah, the twin cities of sin destroyed by divine wrath. But here's what most people don't know. The story didn't start with the Bible. Versions of it, echoes of it, whispers of catastrophic fire from the heavens. They appear in texts that are older, much older, written in languages most people have never heard of, pressed into clay tablets in a land between two rivers, thousands of years before anyone wrote down the book of Genesis. What if the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just a moral tale? What if something actually happened? Something so devastating, so traumatic that multiple civilizations recorded it in their own ways, each trying to make sense of an event that defied explanation. That's what we're here to explore tonight. The intersection of three worlds, ancient Mesopotamian records carved into clay, biblical narratives passed down through generations, and modern archaeological science that's discovered something in the Dead Sea region that nobody expected to find. Something that suggests the fire from heaven might have been horrifyingly real. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I read the comments and it's fascinating. Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, Chicago winding down after dinner. All of us here together diving into mysteries from when writing itself was being invented. The Sumerians lived in what's now southern Iraq, in a place they called the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. They invented some of the first cities, the first writing system, the first complex bureaucracies, and they were obsessed with record keeping. They wrote everything down, king's lists, tax records, astronomical observations, contracts, poetry, and stories. Stories about floods that covered the world, stories about gods who walked among humans, and stories about fire from the sky that wiped out entire populations. For centuries, scholars treated these ancient texts as pure mythology. Interesting cultural artifacts, sure, but nothing to do with actual history. The same went for the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah, just an allegory about sin and punishment, a moral lesson wrapped in dramatic imagery. But something changed in recent years. Archaeologists working in the Dead Sea region, not far from where Sodom and Gomorrah were supposedly located, found evidence of a catastrophic destruction event, not from war, not from earthquake, from something that generated temperatures hot enough to instantly vaporize people, hot enough to turn clay pottery into glass, hot enough to literally boil the rocks. The dating puts this event right around the time the Bible says Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. And when scientists started looking at Sumerian astronomical records, specifically a clay tablet called the planisphere, some researchers found something that made them stop and reconsider everything. An ancient sky map that might, just might, have recorded the incoming trajectory of the very thing that caused all that destruction. Now, before we go any further, this is complicated territory. There are legitimate scholars on all sides of this debate. Some think we found definitive proof of what happened. Others think it's coincidence and wishful thinking. Most are somewhere in between, intrigued by the evidence but cautious about jumping to conclusions. What's not debatable is this. Something catastrophic happened in the Dead Sea region in antiquity. The archaeological evidence is undeniable, and multiple ancient cultures, writing in different languages, separated by centuries and vast distances, all recorded traditions about cities destroyed by fire from above. So tonight we're going to take our time and walk through all of it, the Sumerian texts and what they actually say, the biblical narrative and its historical context, the shocking archaeological discoveries at a site called Tall El Hammam. the scientific theories about cosmic airbursts and their devastating effects, and the bigger questions about how ancient peoples preserved memories of real catastrophes in their myths and sacred writings. We're not here to prove anything. We're here to explore, to look at clay tablets pressed by hands that turned to dust 4,000 years ago, to stand virtually in archaeological trenches where evidence of unimaginable destruction lies buried in the sand, to ask whether the stories we've been told since childhood might contain fragments of something that actually happened. The whispers of fire from the ancient world are faint now, but they're still there if you know how to listen. So let's listen. Let's see where the evidence leads. And let's find out whether the Sumerians, writing on clay long before Moses was born, might have recorded the truth about 2 cities that burned. But it's also dangerous land. The rivers that give life can take it away just as easily. Floods come without warning. Droughts can last years. The flatness means no natural defences, no mountains to hide behind, no highlands to retreat to when the waters rise. Everything is exposed under an enormous sky. Your survival depends entirely on your ability to predict, to plan, to work with others on a scale that had never been attempted before. So humans did something revolutionary. They stopped wandering. They stopped following herds and seasonal plants. They built permanent settlements, not just camps, but actual cities with walls and temples and streets. They dug canals to control the water, built levees to hold back floods, created irrigation systems that could water fields even during dry seasons. This required coordination, hundreds of people working together toward goals that might take years to accomplish. Someone had to organize the labor, distribute the food, resolve disputes about water rights and land boundaries. The Sumerians emerged into history as the people who figured this out first. By 3000 BCE, they had cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. Each city-state functioned as an independent political unit, ruled by a king who also served as the intermediary between humans and gods. Because in Sumerian thinking, the cities didn't belong to people. They belonged to deities who had assigned humans the task of maintaining them. The great temples at the center of each city weren't just places of worship. They were the actual houses where gods lived, and the entire economy revolved around serving them. This created a problem. How do you manage an economy supporting thousands of people? How do you track who owes what? Who's contributed labor to the canal projects? How much grain is stored in the temple warehouses? What trade goods have arrived from distant cities? Memory isn't enough. Oral tradition doesn't work when you need precise numbers and dated records. So around 3200 BCE, Sumerian administrators invented writing, not to record poetry or stories, at least not at first, to track sheep. The earliest clay tablets we've found are accounting records, simple pictograms pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus, then baked hard in the sun or in kilns. This sheep symbol means 1 sheep. This symbol for grain means 1 measure of barley. Build up enough symbols and you've got a record of an entire transaction, something that will last longer than any human memory. Within a few generations, the system evolved. The pictograms became more abstract, more stylized. The reed stylus created wedge-shaped marks, which is why we call it cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge. The language expanded beyond simple accounting. Scribes began recording laws, royal decrees, diplomatic correspondence. They wrote down mathematical tables, astronomical observations, medical texts. They created literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, was written in cuneiform on clay tablets. And here's what matters for our story. Clay is nearly indestructible. Papyrus crumbles, parchment rots, paper burns. But clay, especially clay that's been fired, can survive thousands of years buried in the ground. It's impervious to water, resistant to decay. You can break a tablet into 1,000 pieces, and if you find all the fragments, you can reassemble it and read what someone wrote 4,000 years ago. Their exact words. Their actual handwriting, if you want to call the impressions in clay handwriting. This means the Sumerians left us something priceless. Not myths that were passed down orally and changed with each telling. Not stories that were rewritten and edited by later cultures, but original records, primary sources. The actual tablets pressed by actual scribes who lived through the events they were recording, or who were copying records from people who did. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian civilization was at its height. The cities were thriving. Trade networks connected Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, to Anatolia, to Egypt. Cuneiform had spread throughout the region as the international language of diplomacy and commerce, and Sumerian scribes were recording everything, including catastrophes. The archaeological record shows that Sumerian cities were periodically destroyed by disasters. Some were clearly human-caused, wars between rival city-states or invasions by peoples from the mountains and deserts, but others are harder to explain. Sudden abandonment of settlements, destruction layers that show evidence of intense heat but no signs of military conflict, references in text to divine judgments, to cities being cursed by the gods and erased from existence. One of the most important documents is the Sumerian King List, a text that chronicles the reigns of kings from the mythical past through historical times. It's bizarre and fascinating. Early in the list, kings reign for thousands of years. Then comes a notation that the kingship was interrupted by a great flood. After the flood, the reign lengths drop to more plausible numbers, and the kings start matching up with archaeological evidence. It's as if the scribes were trying to reconcile mythology with actual history, to draw a line between the mythical age and the historical age. But they never stopped believing the mythology was describing real events. To them, the flood wasn't an allegory. It was something that had actually happened, something so catastrophic that civilization itself had to be rebuilt from scratch. Now here's where geography becomes crucial. Sumer occupied the southern part of Mesopotamia, the region closest to the Persian Gulf. To the west and southwest lay the Great Arabian Desert. Beyond that, about 300 miles as the crow flies, was the Dead Sea region, the area where biblical tradition placed Sodom and Gomorrah. 300 miles is nothing in terms of trade and communication networks. The Sumerians weren't isolated. They traded with peoples throughout the Near East. Stories travelled along the same routes as goods. If something catastrophic happened in the Dead Sea region, something visible from great distances, something that traumatized the populations who witnessed it, word would have reached Sumerian cities within weeks or months at most. And the Sumerians would have written it down. Maybe not immediately, maybe not with perfect accuracy, but they would have recorded it somehow, incorporated it into their understanding of how the world worked and how the gods operated. The timeline matters too. The period between 2500 and 2000 BCE represents the late early dynastic period through the Third Dynasty in Sumerian history. This is when cuneiform literature really flourished, when major texts were being compiled and copied, when astronomical observations were being recorded systematically, and it's right in the middle of when biblical scholars generally place the time of Abraham, the time when Sodom and Gomorrah supposedly existed. We have thousands of tablets from this period. Most are mundane, administrative records that nobody reads except specialists. But scattered among them are texts that describe cosmic events, divine interventions, cities destroyed by fire from heaven. For generations, scholars treated these as pure mythology, religious poetry disconnected from any historical reality. But what if they weren't? What if buried in those tablets, pressed into clay by scribes who never imagined anyone would read their words thousands of years later, There's evidence of something real, something that happened in a place close enough that the Sumerians knew about it, dramatic enough that they felt compelled to record it, terrifying enough that they interpreted it as an act of divine judgment. The tablets are still there, in museums, in private collections, in archaeological sites that haven't been fully excavated. Most haven't been translated. Many haven't even been catalogued properly. We're still discovering what the Sumerians knew and what they witnessed. And some of what they recorded might change everything we thought we knew about ancient history. Let's start with the story itself, the account that's been read and reread for thousands of years until the words have become almost too familiar to really hear anymore. Genesis chapters 18 and 19. Abraham is living as a nomadic herdsman somewhere in the region that would become Canaan. 3 visitors appear at his tent, messengers who reveal that 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, have become so corrupt that they're marked for destruction. Abraham, whose nephew Lot lives in Sodom, begins to negotiate. Would God spare the cities if 50 righteous people could be found there? What about 45? 40? 30? The number keeps dropping. 20? 10? The negotiation has this strange, almost desperate quality, as if Abraham knows what's coming and is trying anything to prevent it. The messengers travel to Sodom. Lot meets them at the city gate and insists they stay at his house. The hospitality matters here. In the ancient Near East, taking someone into your home created obligations. You became responsible for their safety. When the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand he hand over his guests, Lot refuses. He's so committed to protecting them that he offers his own daughters instead, which tells you something about ancient moral priorities that makes modern readers deeply uncomfortable. The visitors reveal themselves as angels. They strike the mob with blindness and tell Lot to gather his family and leave immediately. The city is going to be destroyed. Lot's sons-in-law think he's joking. His wife is reluctant. Even Lot himself hesitates until the angels physically drag them out of the city. They're told to run for the hills, and whatever they do, don't look back. Then comes the destruction. The text is specific. The Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Not from the earth, from heaven. The language is emphatic. This isn't a volcano, isn't an earthquake. Something is coming from above. Abraham, watching from a distance, sees what looks like smoke from a furnace rising from the plain. The cities and everyone in them are gone. The fertile valley where they stood is devastated. And Lot's wife, who looked back despite the warning, becomes a pillar of salt. The account mentions 5 cities of the plain. Sodom and Gomorrah are the famous ones, but there were also Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. The text suggests all 5 were targeted, though Zoar was spared because Lot asked to flee there. 4 cities destroyed in a single event. That's not a localized disaster. That's regional devastation. For most of history, this story was read theologically. It was about divine judgment, about the consequences of wickedness, about the importance of hospitality and righteousness. The rabbinical tradition used Sodom as shorthand for the worst kind of evil. The prophets referenced it constantly as the ultimate example of a society that had gone wrong. Jesus mentioned Sodom multiple times in warnings about cities that rejected his message. The theological interpretation centered on moral lessons. God punishes the wicked. The righteous are saved. Disobedience, even something as seemingly minor as looking back, has consequences. These were powerful teachings, useful for maintaining social order and religious devotion. But notice what gets lost when you read it purely as theology. The specific details, the precision of the language about fire from heaven, the description of smoke rising like a furnace, the strange detail about Lot's wife becoming salt, the fact that Abraham could see the destruction from miles away, suggesting something visible across vast distances. The indication that the entire valley, not just the cities themselves, was affected. And there's something else. The account is embedded in a narrative framework that treats it as history, not as parable. Abraham is a character in an ongoing story. His life before this event connects to his life after. Lot's daughters have children after escaping, and those children become the ancestors of neighbouring peoples, the Moabites and Ammonites. The geographical references are specific. The cities were in the plain, in the region of the Jordan. The Dead Sea is mentioned by its ancient name, the Salt Sea. This doesn't read like mythology. It reads like someone trying to explain something that actually happened, something that traumatized the survivors enough that the story got passed down, generation after generation, until it was eventually written down. The pillar of salt detail is fascinating because it's so specific and so weird. Why salt? If you're inventing a morality tale about the dangers of disobedience, you could have Lot's wife die in any number of ways. She could be struck by lightning, consumed by fire, swallowed by the earth. But instead she becomes salt. The Dead Sea region is full of salt formations. The water is so saturated with minerals that salt crystallizes everywhere. There are rock formations along the shore that look like human figures, twisted pillars created by erosion and mineral deposits. Early travellers reported seeing them, and locals pointed them out as the remains of Lot's wife. But there's another possibility. If something catastrophic happened in that region, something involving intense heat and pressure, and if someone was caught in the aftermath, their body could theoretically be covered in mineral deposits, preserved in salt like meat in an ancient preservation technique. The detail might not be metaphorical at all. It might be describing exactly what Abraham's people found when they went looking for survivors. The brimstone reference is equally specific. The Hebrew word is gophrith, which refers to sulfur. Sulfur burns with an intense distinctive smell and leaves yellow residue. It's associated with volcanic activity, but there are no volcanoes in the Dead Sea region. There haven't been for millions of years. So where would sulfur come from? Some biblical scholars argue the entire account is borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian flood narratives and adapted to teach moral lessons specific to Hebrew culture. They point out similarities to Sumerian and Babylonian stories about divine judgment and catastrophic destruction. The connection is undeniable, but that raises a question rather than settling it. If multiple ancient Near Eastern cultures were telling stories about cities destroyed by fire from heaven, about divine judgment manifesting as cosmic catastrophe, were they all just making up similar stories independently, or were they all trying to explain the same event, filtering it through their own cultural and theological frameworks? The biblical account might preserve details that Sumerian records corroborate, or Sumerian tablets might contain astronomical or geological data that explains what the biblical writers witnessed but couldn't fully understand. The accounts aren't contradictory. They might be complementary, different perspectives on the same reality. But to see how they fit together, we need to look at what the Sumerians actually recorded about catastrophes, about cities destroyed by the gods, about fire falling from the sky. We need to examine the tablets themselves and see what they tell us about cosmic events that terrified the ancient world. There's this object. It doesn't look like much. A clay prism about 8 inches tall, covered in dense cuneiform script, sitting in a museum case where most visitors walk right past it. But if you stop and read what's written there, things get strange fast. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it's basically an ancient chronicle of who ruled what and for how long. Except the numbers make no sense. The earliest king supposedly reigned for thousands of years, some for tens of thousands. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. His successor managed 36,000. These aren't just exaggerations. They're systematically recorded, carefully preserved across multiple copies spanning centuries. The scribes weren't being careless. They were copying what earlier records told them. Then comes a line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After this statement, the numbers suddenly become reasonable. Kings reigned for decades, maybe a century or two if you're being generous with the math. It's as if the scribes are marking time in two different worlds, before the catastrophe and after. Everything prior exists in a kind of mythological deep time. Everything after fits within recognizable human lifespans. But here's what makes this relevant to our Fire from Heaven story. The king list wasn't unique. It was part of a broader Mesopotamian tradition of documenting disasters. The Sumerians and their successors were obsessive record keepers. They didn't just track kings and dynasties. They documented floods, droughts, earthquakes, eclipses, anything unusual that happened in the sky or on the earth. They believed these events carried meaning, that the gods spoke through natural phenomena. So when something catastrophic happened, scribes wrote it down in excruciating detail. And they wrote about cities being destroyed a lot. The archaeological record from Mesopotamia contains dozens of texts describing urban destruction. Some are administrative records, dry bureaucratic accounts of which cities were depopulated and when. Others are poetic lamentations, elaborate ritual texts meant to be performed when a city fell. The most famous are the lamentation texts, compositions of extraordinary literary power that describe the complete annihilation of major urban centres. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur describes storms that devastate the land, fire that consumes temples, city abandoned by their protective gods. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur goes even further. It describes something falling from the sky, something that burns and destroys everything it touches. The language is theological, yes. The gods have abandoned the city. Divine wrath is being enacted. But underneath the religious interpretation, you can see descriptions of physical events, buildings collapsing, fire spreading through streets, people fleeing in terror as something descends from above. The Era Epic, a Babylonian text from the 1st millennium BCE, describes the god Era raining destruction on cities that have displeased him. But the descriptions are specific. Burning wind, fire from heaven, devastation that leaves the land uninhabitable. One passage describes survivors wandering through ruins where the ground itself has been transformed, where nothing will grow anymore, where the water has become poisonous. This doesn't sound like metaphor. It sounds like someone trying to explain environmental catastrophe in the only language available to them. What's remarkable is how consistent these motifs are across centuries and across different Mesopotamian cultures. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, they all preserved stories about cities destroyed by divine fire. They all described phenomena descending from the sky. They all talked about the aftermath in terms that suggest real environmental devastation, not just military conquest or normal urban decline. The scribes who recorded these events were trained professionals. They spent years learning to read and write cuneiform, mastering astronomical observations, studying the precedents and patterns in earlier texts. They weren't primitive people making up stories around campfires. They were the intellectuals of their age, working in temple complexes and palaces, maintaining records that stretch back thousands of years. When they wrote about fire from heaven, they were documenting something. But documenting what exactly? That's where it gets complicated. Some scholars argue these texts are purely mythological, theological explanations for military defeats and political collapse. When a city fell to invaders, the scribes would compose lamentations attributing the destruction to divine abandonment. The fire from heaven motif was just a literary convention, a way of saying the gods had turned against the city. According to this interpretation, we shouldn't look for historical events behind these texts. They're religious literature, not historical records. Other scholars aren't so sure. They point out that Mesopotamian scribes were perfectly capable of distinguishing between military conquest and natural disaster. They had different vocabulary for each. When Babylon was sacked by the Hittites, records describe armies, sieges, the specific human agents of destruction. When texts describe fire falling from the sky, they use different language that emphasizes the cosmic, the unprecedented, the inexplicable. And there's another category of text that gets really interesting: astronomical diaries and omen texts. Mesopotamian astronomers watched the sky constantly, recording unusual phenomena, comets, meteors, eclipses. Anything out of the ordinary got written down because these events were believed to predict earthly disasters. The divination texts compiled over centuries list celestial signs and their earthly consequences. Some of these read like they're describing impact events, rocks falling from heaven, fire spreading across the land, destruction of cities following celestial omens. The famous Akkadian text known as the Era Epic contains a passage that's been debated for decades. It describes something that swept across the land like a storm, that flashed like lightning, that scattered destruction like fire. Some translators render this as purely metaphorical divine wrath. Others suggest it's describing an actual atmospheric phenomenon, something bright and destructive that moved across the sky and struck the earth. The lamentation texts also contain recurring imagery of storms that aren't quite storms, of winds that carry fire, of devastation that comes from above rather than from invading armies. One passage describes people looking up and seeing the radiance of the storm, seeing fire descend, seeing their city consumed before their gods could protect them. The theological framework is clear. The gods have withdrawn their protection. But the physical descriptions underneath suggest eyewitness accounts of something real, something terrifying, something that came from the sky and destroyed everything it touched. What makes these records matter for our investigation into Sodom and Gomorrah is timing and geography. These texts span thousands of years, but many of the most vivid descriptions of fire from heaven cluster in a particular period. The late 3rd millennium BCE, roughly contemporary with the time frame when biblical scholars place Abraham and the destruction of the cities of the plain, and Sumer wasn't far from the Dead Sea region. A major catastrophe in one area would have been witnessed, discussed, recorded in the other. The scribes were talking to each other across cultures. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia to Canaan. Ideas, stories, and records of unusual events would have spread along those same networks. If something catastrophic happened in the Dead Sea region, Sumerian scribes would have heard about it. If something catastrophic happened in Sumer, it might have been visible or felt hundreds of miles away. The ancient Near East was interconnected in ways we often underestimate. Disasters didn't stay local. Their effects and their stories radiated outward. So when we find Sumerian records describing fire from heaven, and biblical texts describing fire from heaven, when both traditions place these events in roughly the same historical window, the question becomes unavoidable. Are they describing the same thing? There's another object, even stranger than the king list. It was found in the ruins of Nineveh's ancient library, buried under centuries of ash and debris from the city's destruction in 612 BCE. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal had collected texts from across Mesopotamia, gathering the accumulated knowledge of millennia into one massive archive. When his library burned, the fire baked thousands of clay tablets hard enough to survive 2,600 years. Most of those tablets contain the kind of thing you'd expect: administrative records, literary texts, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions. But one tablet is different. It's circular, about 6 inches across, covered with strange markings that look like nothing else in the collection. Lines radiating from the center, annotations in cuneiform around the edges, diagrams that took decades to understand. Modern researchers call it the Planisphere Tablet, and it might be the oldest star map in human history. The tablet shows the night sky. not as we'd map it today with telescopes and satellites, but as an ancient astronomer would have seen it, standing in Mesopotamia on a specific night, watching the movement of celestial objects across the dome of heaven. The radiating lines represent sight paths across the sky. The cuneiform notes identify constellations, planets, and something else. Something that doesn't belong in a routine astronomical record. For most of the 20th century after its discovery, nobody knew what to make of it. The tablet was catalogued, photographed, filed away in academic publications as an interesting but obscure example of Mesopotamian skywatching. Then, in 2008, two British researchers, Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel, published an analysis that changed everything. They claimed they'd cracked the tablet's code, and what they found wasn't just an astronomical record. It was documentation of a disaster. According to Bond and Hempsel's interpretation, the planisphere wasn't mapping the regular movements of planets and stars. It was tracking something unusual, something catastrophic, an object moving through the sky on a trajectory that would bring it into collision with Earth. They worked backward from the tablet's notations, using modern astronomical software to reconstruct what the night sky would have looked like from Mesopotamia on the date the ancient astronomer had recorded. The computer simulation kept pointing them to a specific moment in time. June 29, 3123 BCE, just before dawn. The tablet, they argued, recorded the approach path of an asteroid, a massive chunk of rock that an ancient observer watched descending through the atmosphere, bright enough to be visible against the pre-dawn sky, moving fast enough that its trajectory could be plotted in the minutes before impact. The annotations around the edge described its path across specific constellations. The diagram showed where it would strike, and according to their calculations, the impact point wasn't in Mesopotamia. It was to the southwest, somewhere in the region we now call the Eastern Mediterranean or the Northern Dead Sea Valley. An asteroid strike on June 29, 3123 BCE. The date sent shockwaves through certain circles of biblical archaeology because it fell right in the middle of the time frame some scholars had proposed for Abraham and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not proof of anything, but a correlation strange enough to demand attention. If an ancient Mesopotamian astronomer had watched an asteroid approach and plotted its impact trajectory toward the cities of the plain, that would explain a lot. It would explain why the biblical account describes fire from heaven. It would explain the Mesopotamian texts about divine destruction raining from the sky. It would provide a natural mechanism for the kind of catastrophic, total devastation described in Genesis. Bond and Hempsel went further. They proposed that the asteroid didn't hit the ground directly. Instead, it exploded in the atmosphere, creating a massive airburst similar to the Tunguska event that flattened 800 square miles of Siberian forest in 1908. The difference was scale. Tunguska released energy equivalent to 10 or 15 megatons of TNT. The object recorded on the planisphere tablet would have been larger, much larger, big enough to devastate everything within a radius of hundreds of miles, big enough to leave evidence that would persist for millennia, big enough to be remembered. The mainstream archaeological community was not impressed. The responses range from polite skepticism to outright dismissal. Critics pointed out that ancient astronomical texts are notoriously difficult to interpret. The symbolism is complex, the reference frames unfamiliar, the possibility of misreading enormous. What Bond and Hempsel saw as an asteroid trajectory, others interpreted as routine planetary observations, maybe Venus and Mercury moving through their regular cycles. The cuneiform annotations, some argued, had been mistranslated or taken out of context. The date calculation relied on assumptions about ancient Mesopotamian timekeeping that couldn't be verified. Other scholars questioned whether a single tablet could bear the weight of such dramatic claims. Mesopotamian astronomers were meticulous record keepers. If they'd witnessed an asteroid impact, surely there would be multiple documents, cross-references, detailed descriptions in other texts. The fact that the planisphere stands alone, without corroboration from contemporary sources, suggested it was being overinterpreted. Maybe it was just an unusual star chart, interesting but not evidence of catastrophe. The debate revealed something important about how we read ancient texts. Are we looking at them through our own expectations, finding what we want to find? Or are we finally developing the technical tools to understand what ancient observers actually saw? Bond and Hempsel use computer simulations of the ancient sky, mathematical reconstruction of possible trajectories, forensic analysis of the tablet's markings. Previous generations of scholars didn't have those tools. They had to rely on linguistic analysis and cultural context alone. Does that mean earlier interpretations were more objective or just more limited? But even skeptics acknowledge the planisphere is recording something. The tablet's astronomical accuracy is impressive. Whoever created it understood celestial mechanics, knew how to track objects moving through the sky, could annotate what they saw with precision that survived millennia. Whether it's mapping an asteroid or documenting planetary movements, it represents sophisticated scientific observation from 5,000 years ago, and it keeps company with all those other Mesopotamian texts describing fire from heaven, divine destruction, cities consumed by burning wind. Stand the planisphere alongside the king list's record of catastrophe, next to the lamentation texts with their descriptions of devastation descending from above, beside the era epic's accounts of burning wind and poisoned land. A pattern emerges, not proof, but something. A persistent tradition of recording disasters that came from the sky, that destroyed cities, that left the land transformed. The ancient scribes were watching, they were writing it down, and now we're trying to figure out what they saw. There's a story older than the planisphere, older than most of what survives from ancient Mesopotamia. It comes to us on tablets that predate the biblical texts by more than 1,000 years, and it tells the story of humanity's near destruction at the hands of angry gods. The Atrahasis Epic. One of the oldest narratives ever written down, composed sometime around 1800 BCE, though the story itself is clearly much older, passed down through oral tradition for generations before anyone thought to preserve it in cuneiform. The epic begins with the world in its infancy. The gods are doing all the work themselves, digging canals, maintaining rivers, dredging irrigation channels. It's exhausting, endless labour, and the lesser gods are getting tired of it. So the senior deities decide to create something new, humans, not as beloved children or spiritual beings, but as workers, slave labour to take over the tasks the gods don't want to do anymore. We're created from clay mixed with the blood of a slaughtered god, given just enough intelligence to follow instructions, but not enough to cause trouble. For a while, the arrangement works. Humans multiply, spread across the land, do the work they were designed for. But then something unexpected happens. We get too numerous, too loud. The text describes humanity as a roaring noise that disturbs the rest of the gods. The chief deity, Enlil, can't sleep. Our constant activity, our voices, the sheer overwhelming presence of human civilization keeps him awake, and his solution isn't to adapt or move somewhere quieter. His solution is extermination. If humans are the problem, eliminate the humans. He tries different methods. First, he sends plague, a devastating disease that sweeps through human populations, killing thousands. But not enough. Some survive, reproduce. The noise begins again. So Enlil tries drought. He withholds the rain, dries up the rivers, turns the fertile land to dust. Crops fail, animals die, humans starve in massive numbers. But again, not all of them. Some endure, find water sources, keep the species alive. The noise gradually returns. Enlil escalates. He tries famine, not just from drought, but from agricultural failure across all regions simultaneously. The text describes the desperation in brutal detail, parents eating their own children, communities descending into cannibalism, the natural order collapsing as humans fight over the last scraps of food. Yet even this doesn't finish the job. A remnant survives. The noise, quieter now but still present, continues to disturb the gods' rest. Finally, Enlil decides on a permanent solution. He'll send a flood, not a seasonal overflow or a bad storm, but a catastrophic deluge that will drown every human, every animal, everything that moves on the earth's surface. Total annihilation. He convinces the other gods to help, binds them to secrecy so humans won't have warning. The plan is unanimous, except for one god who disagrees. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, takes pity on humanity. Specifically on one human, a man named Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise. Enki can't directly defy Enlil's decree, but he finds a workaround. He speaks to the wall of Atrahasis's house, knowing the man is on the other side listening. He describes in detail how to build a boat large enough to hold Atrahasis's family and breeding pairs of animals, how to waterproof it with pitch, how to load provisions for a long voyage, how to seal it when the waters come. The flood arrives exactly as warned. The sky opens, rivers overflow, the foundations of the earth break apart, water rises from below and falls from above simultaneously. The text describes the terror of it. Gods themselves fleeing to the highest heaven, shocked by the destruction they've unleashed. The waters cover everything, every mountain, every plateau, every last refuge. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm rages, and when it finally stops, only Atrahasis and those on his boat remain alive. If this sounds familiar, it should. The biblical flood narrative in Genesis follows the same basic structure. God decides to destroy humanity. One righteous man is warned. He builds a boat. The flood comes. A remnant survives. The Noah story is essentially a Hebrew retelling of this much older Mesopotamian tradition. But there's a crucial difference in the moral framework, in the why behind the destruction. In the Atrahasis epic, humans haven't done anything morally wrong. We're not sinful or wicked or corrupt. We're just too noisy, too numerous, too successful at multiplying and filling the earth. Our crime is existing too loudly. The gods destroy us not as punishment but as pest control. We're an inconvenience to be eliminated. The biblical account transforms this into a moral judgment. Humanity is destroyed because we've become evil, violent, corrupt beyond redemption. Noah survives not just because a god likes him, but because he's righteous, morally superior to his contemporaries. Same event, completely different justification. But both traditions preserve something else, the possibility of destruction coming from divine sources, whether gods or God. The idea that catastrophic events affecting entire civilizations might have supernatural origins, or at least be interpreted that way by survivors. And the Atrahasis flood isn't the only destructive act in the epic. The earlier attempts, the plague and drought and famine, show gods using different tools of destruction. Fire doesn't feature prominently in Atrahasis, but it appears everywhere else in Mesopotamian mythology. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around the same period, contains its own flood narrative with similar details. Utnapishtim, the Gilgamesh version of Atrahasis, describes the approach of the storm in terms that sound almost volcanic. The weather god Adad roaring in the clouds, fire god setting the land ablaze, darkness covering everything so completely that people can't see each other. Then the water comes, but the build-up involves fire and smoke and burning wind. Other texts are even more explicit. The Era epic describing the destructive rage of the war god talks about fire-consuming cities, burning wind that leaves nothing alive, devastation falling from above that transforms fertile land into poisoned waste. The lamentation texts mourning destroyed cities describe fire descending from heaven, burning wind that topples walls, destruction that comes from the sky without warning. These aren't always floods. Sometimes the gods destroy with fire, with burning rain, with stones falling from above, with wind so hot it scorches flesh. The pattern suggests Mesopotamian cultures preserved memories of multiple catastrophic events, different types of disasters, different mechanisms of destruction, but all framed as divine punishment or divine caprice. Floods from angry gods, fire from heaven sent by vengeful deities, burning wind released by gods at war. The supernatural explanation makes sense in a culture without modern science. If you don't know about asteroids, climate change, volcanic eruptions, or seismic activity, attributing disasters to divine action is logical. The gods are angry. The gods are fighting. The gods have decided to destroy us. What other explanation fits? But maybe, beneath a theological framework, these stories preserve actual events. Real catastrophes that ancient peoples experienced, interpreted through their religious worldview and passed down in mythological form. The flood narratives might remember real flooding from climate shifts or glacial melting. The fire from heaven might remember asteroid impacts or volcanic eruptions. The burning wind might be cultural memory of catastrophic wildfires or superheated blast waves from explosions. We're left reading these ancient texts at two levels simultaneously. As mythology, they tell us how Mesopotamian cultures understood divine power and human vulnerability. As possible historical records, they might preserve fragments of actual disasters experienced by real people who had no scientific vocabulary to describe what they witnessed. The Atrahasis epic isn't a geology textbook, but it might contain clues about events that shaped the ancient world more profoundly than we've recognized. And when these Mesopotamian destruction narratives are placed alongside biblical accounts of Sodom and Gomorrah, the resonances become difficult to ignore. Different cultures, different theological frameworks, but similar patterns. Cities destroyed by fire from heaven, devastation so complete it becomes legendary. Survivors telling stories that get written down and preserved for millennia. The question isn't whether these disasters happened. The question is what actually caused them, and whether the ancient texts contain enough detail to figure that out thousands of years later. If the Mesopotamian tablets give us the stories, Tall El Hammam is where some researchers think we may be staring straight at the smoking crater. Not a literal crater. That's part of the mystery. On the eastern edge of the Jordan Valley, just north of the Dead Sea, there's a low mound rising out of the landscape. To a casual passerby, it looks like any other tell in the Near East. A layered hill of ruins, cities stacked on cities, each one built on the bones of the last. But when archaeologists started digging here in the early 2000s, they realized this site wasn't just another minor town in an old river valley. It was a giant. Tall El Hammam, as it's known, turned out to be one of the largest Bronze Age cities in the southern Levant, bigger than most of its neighbours, possibly the dominant urban centre in the entire region for hundreds of years. Picture a thriving city around 1700 BCE. Massive defensive walls, some over 30 metres thick in places, a towering acropolis on the upper mound, temples and palatial buildings looking out across the Jordan Valley. Below, a sprawling lower city, densely packed with houses, courtyards, workshops and streets. Surrounding it all, rich agricultural land, watered by the Jordan and local springs, fields of grain, orchards, flocks grazing under the sun. This wasn't a lonely outpost. It was plugged into the wider Bronze Age world. Pottery styles show connections to cities across Canaan. Imported luxury items hint at long-distance trade routes reaching out toward Mesopotamia and Egypt. Whoever controlled Tol El Hammam was wealthy, organized, and powerful. And then, one day, the city died. Archaeologists digging through the layers of occupation noticed something strange as they approached the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Instead of the usual signs of gradual decline or peaceful abandonment, they hit a destruction layer. That in itself isn't unusual in the ancient Near East. Cities burned, walls fell, conquerors came and went. What was unusual was the way things were destroyed. The destruction horizon at Tol El Hammam is thin, only a metre or so in many places, but it's astonishingly violent. Mud brick walls sheared off and tossed sideways. Stones catapulted, not just collapsed. Pottery smashed into tiny fragments scattered like shrapnel, and mixed through the debris strange clues that didn't fit ordinary warfare or fire. There was glass. Not glass vessels, but mud brick and pottery that had partially melted, their surfaces fused into a glassy sheen, clay roof tiles with one side blistered and vitrified, as if they had faced an unimaginable blast of heat, while the other side remained closer to normal. Small bits of building material turned into frothy, aerated lumps, like the slag left over from metal smelting, except this was spread across an entire city, not confined to a furnace. Some materials appeared to have boiled, not just burned. Zircon crystals inside pottery had been transformed into baddelite, something that usually happens only under extreme temperatures. Tiny metal grains were found embedded in melted surfaces, as if they'd been sprayed there at high speed. Comet or asteroid fragment entered Earth's atmosphere above the Jordan Valley, exploded in the air, and unleashed a massive thermal and shock wave on the city below. Not an impact into the ground, which would leave a crater, but a detonation in the sky, like the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908. In Tunguska, a roughly 50-metre object exploded at an altitude of several kilometres, flattening over 2,000 square kilometres of forest, knocking down trees like matchsticks and generating intense heat over a wide radius. No crater, just toppled trunks, scorched bark, and stunned witnesses describing a fireball brighter than the sun. The Tol El Hammam team suggested something similar happened here, only above a densely populated Bronze Age city instead of empty taiga. Based on the melted surfaces, the mineral transformations, and the distribution of debris, their models proposed an airburst delivering temperatures possibly exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius at ground level in parts of the city. That's hotter than many volcanic eruptions at the point where lava emerges, hot enough to melt metals, liquefy sand into glass, and flash-ignite organic materials. The shock wave from such an explosion would travel at hundreds of kilometers per hour, slamming into buildings, shredding bodies, flinging heavy stones like toys. Anyone in the open would be incinerated or torn apart. Those inside structures might die in an instant from collapsing roofs and superheated air. Fires would erupt everywhere at once, but many things would already be burned before the flames had time to spread. The paper went further. It noted that not only Tol El Hammam, but many nearby settlements in the lower Jordan Valley show a break in occupation around the same time, roughly 1650 BCE, give or take a few decades. For centuries afterward, around 600 years, the region appears to have been largely abandoned. A once fertile, densely settled plain suddenly becomes quiet. One explanation: the airburst didn't just destroy the city, it also salted the surrounding fields with intense heat and shock, possibly vaporizing or scattering salts from the Dead Sea area across the farmland. Croplands could have become temporarily poisoned, too saline to sustain normal agriculture. Survivors, if there were any, would have had to move, and over generations people might remember this region as cursed, dangerous, a place where something terrible had happened. Fire from the sky that makes the land uninhabitable, cities reduced to ash in a single moment. A fertile plain turned into a wasteland, then avoided for centuries. The 2021 study ignited its own kind of firestorm, but in academic circles. Some researchers found the data compelling: shocked quartz, melted building materials, strange spherules under the microscope, all consistent with very high-energy events. Others urged caution, pointing out uncertainties in dating, gaps in the evidence, and the need for independent confirmation. Cosmic airbursts are rare but real. Connecting one to a specific archaeological layer is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims invite intense scrutiny. Still, the picture that emerges from Tall El Hammam is hard to ignore. A major Bronze Age city, flourishing for centuries, erased in a single, catastrophic event involving extreme heat and violent blast. A destruction layer unlike typical warfare. A long regional abandonment in its wake. You don't have to believe every detail of the airburst model to recognize that something very unusual happened there. Something fast, fiery, and absolute enough that, for the people who saw it, the gods rained down destruction would have been the only explanation that made sense. And when you place that smoking archaeological puzzle piece beside the Mesopotamian stories of fire and flood, and the biblical language about cities in the plain consumed by fire from heaven, the landscape of the Jordan Valley begins to look less like a quiet biblical backdrop and more like the stage for a catastrophe that left marks in both the ground and the stories people told. The tablets give us mythic language. Tall El Hammam offers a layer of melted brick and shattered stone. The next question is whether the physics of the sky can bridge the distance between the two. What exactly is a cosmic airburst? And why are some scientists willing to connect one to an ancient story about a city burned from the sky? When most of us picture a space rock hitting Earth, we imagine a crater, a clean impact, a bowl in the ground like Meteor Crater in Arizona. But many incoming objects never make it that far. They slam into the upper atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second, and the air becomes in effect stone. The pressure builds, the object heats, fractures, and then, at a certain altitude, it fails catastrophically. Not by gently breaking apart, but by detonating. That's a cosmic airburst. Instead of a single punch into the ground, the energy is dumped into the air in a fraction of a second. The result is a blinding fireball, an expanding sphere of superheated gas, and a shock wave that races outward, hammering everything below. No crater, just blast and heat, spread over a wide area. We've seen this in modern times. In 1908, over the remote forests of Tunguska in Siberia, something around 50 meters across exploded in the atmosphere. No one saw the object itself clearly, but witnesses reported a second sun, the sky splitting with light, and a shock so powerful it knocked people off their feet dozens of kilometers away. The blast flattened trees over an area larger than a major city, burning bark on the sides facing the explosion, leaving the ground craterless but transformed. If Tunguska had happened over London, or Cairo, or New York, it wouldn't be a footnote in astronomy textbooks. It would be a defining moment in human history. The Tall El Hammam team argues that something on that spectrum happened over the lower Jordan Valley in the Middle Bronze Age. Not identical to Tunguska, but governed by the same physics. Their case rests on small things as much as large ones. Under the microscope they describe finding shocked quartz in the destruction layer. Quartz is a common mineral, but when it's subjected to extremely high pressures, like those from nuclear blasts or large impacts, its crystal lattice deforms in specific telltale ways. These microscopic scars don't show up in ordinary fires, or even in most volcanic eruptions. They're like fingerprints of sudden, overwhelming force. Mixed with the debris are tiny spherules, rounded droplets of material that appear to have melted and then cooled while flying through the air. Some are rich in iron, others in silica. Their composition and textures suggest they formed at temperatures far beyond what city fires can achieve, more akin to the conditions near an explosion in the sky than a burning building on the ground. There are also unusual mineral transformations, zircon crystals altered into badleyite, indicating exposure to temperatures above about 1,600 degrees Celsius. In some samples, surfaces of pottery and mud brick are fused into a thin, glossy layer, while the underlying material remains comparatively unaltered. It's as if a blowtorch hotter than a volcano swept across them for just an instant. Taken together, shocked quartz, spherules, high-temperature mineral phases, directional blast damage, the pattern resembles what scientists see at other suspected airburst and impact sites, scaled to the footprint of a Bronze Age city. None of this on its own says Bible. It just says something big, fast, and very hot happened here. The Bible brings its own language. In Genesis, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is described as sulfur and fire, raining from the Lord out of heaven, rising smoke like that of a furnace, a fertile plain suddenly desolated. Later traditions add details of scorching heat, sudden annihilation, and land so altered it becomes a byword for ruin. If you imagine being in the Jordan Valley on the day a cosmic airburst occurred, no science, no word for asteroid, but a full view of the sky, you don't need much creativity to bridge the gap between those descriptions and the physical model. A flash brighter than the sun, a roaring, rushing sound like 1,000 storms at once, a blast of wind that rips roofs away, hurls people and animals through the air, heat so intense it strips moisture from your skin in an instant, ignites clothing, chars wood, melts plaster into glass. From the ground, with Bronze Age eyes and Bronze Age vocabulary, what else would you call it but fire from heaven? The parallels are part of what makes the tall El Hammam proposal so attention-grabbing. A cosmological disaster, a city on the Kikar, the plain of the Jordan suddenly obliterated, fields ruined, the area left sparsely inhabited for centuries. It's easy to see why some researchers frame this as science meeting scripture, not in a triumphalist sense, but as two very different records possibly pointing to the same kind of event. That raises a sensitive question: timing. The destruction layer at Tall El Hammam is usually dated to around 1650 BCE, give or take several decades, depending on which chronological scheme you use for the Bronze Age Levant. Traditional biblical chronologies that place Abraham and the patriarchs around the Middle Bronze Age can be stretched to overlap with this window. Other models, especially those aligning the patriarchal narratives more loosely with later traditions, suggest a wider possible range, or interpret the stories as theological compositions set against a remembered ancient landscape, rather than precise historical diaries. If Tall El Hammam really is the historical kernel behind the Sodom story, it would imply that memories of a specific catastrophe persisted in the region's oral traditions for generations, eventually woven into the fabric of Israelite sacred history. That's plausible. Cultures around the world preserve disaster memories for centuries, but it isn't provable. The dating overlaps, but it doesn't lock. Not everyone is convinced that an airburst happened here at all. Critics of the 2021 study have raised several objections. Some argue that shocked quartz and spherules can occasionally be misidentified or produced by processes not yet fully understood in archaeological contexts. Others question whether the sample sizes are large enough, or whether the destruction layer has been dated with sufficient precision to justify such a dramatic interpretation. There are also more conventional explanations on the table. A massive earthquake, followed by city-wide fires, could topple walls and burn buildings in chaotic ways. An intense conflagration fueled by stored grain, oil, and wooden architecture can create remarkably high localized temperatures, especially in enclosed spaces. Some scholars suggest that the abandonment of the lower Jordan Valley might be explained by gradual environmental changes shifting trade routes, or political instability without invoking a once-in-millennia cosmic event. From this perspective, the airburst model risks being a spectacular answer in search of a question. The unusual evidence is acknowledged, but the leap to asteroid explosion is seen as premature. The debate is ongoing and probably will be for years. New analyses, new samples, and independent replications will either sharpen the airburst picture or blur it. But step back for a moment from the laboratory arguments and imagine the human experience, whichever mechanism you prefer. You're a farmer, or a potter, or a child in a house near the city wall. The day is ordinary until it isn't. The sky blooms with the light you've never seen. For a heartbeat, shadows are razor sharp. Then a wall of heat and wind hits, and the world dissolves into noise, flame, and falling stone. If you survive, you don't walk away thinking about pressure waves and thermal flux. You tell your children that the heavens opened and the gods, or God, cast down fire. You point to the blackened ruins and the salt-scarred fields and say, "There, that's where it happened. Don't go too close." Generations later, perhaps in another town, another culture, storytellers rework that memory. They attach names to the cities. They frame the destruction in moral terms, as judgment, as warning, as mystery. The physics remains the same. The meaning shifts. That is the strange space where the cosmic airburst theory lives, halfway between a blast in the atmosphere and a line of scripture. Not proving the Bible, not disproving it, but suggesting that beneath the layers of theology and symbolism there may lie the echo of a real, terrible night when the sky itself seemed to fall on the plain. And if the sky once fell here, it matters what kind of land it fell on. To understand that, we have to look more closely at the Dead Sea region itself, the geography of a disaster that may have shaped not just one story, but an entire landscape of fear and fascination. Imagine standing on the floor of a broken continent. The entire Jordan Rift Valley, from northern Syria down through the Red Sea, is part of a great tectonic scar, the boundary between the African plate and the Arabian plate. Instead of colliding like the Himalayas, these plates slide past and stretch, creating a long, deep trough. The Dead Sea sits in one of the deepest pockets of that trough. Its surface today lies more than 400 meters below global sea level. The bottom plunges far deeper still. On either side, steep, jagged cliffs rise from the shoreline, the Judean hills to the west, the Moabite plateau to the east, like the edges of a vast sunken bowl. In the Bronze Age, travellers coming down from the highlands would have watched the land fall away beneath their feet. The air grow heavier, the heat intensify, until the world seemed to sink into a haze of salt and light. Water flows in from the Jordan River and a few seasonal streams, but there is no outlet. Whatever runs down into this basin stays there, trapped. Under the relentless sun, water continuously evaporates, leaving behind the minerals it carried. Over thousands of years, that process has turned the Dead Sea into one of the saltiest lakes on Earth. Salt shapes everything here. Along the western shores rise long, pale bluffs that are not just stone, but massive deposits of rock salt and gypsum. The most famous of these is Mount Sodom, a ridge literally made of salt riddled with caves slowly deforming and flowing under its own weight. Rain cuts gullies, exposing fresh crystalline faces that glint in the sun. Blocks slump and crack. It is a landscape that looks brittle, as if one good shock could send entire walls shearing away. Salt is not the only strange substance seeping out of this ground. For millennia, the shores of the Dead Sea have been known for their bitumen, thick, tar-like petroleum that oozes naturally from the subsurface. Ancient texts speak of slime pits in the valley of Siddim, a name some associate with the southern basin of the Dead Sea. Greek and Roman writers describe black lumps of bitumen floating on the water, collected for use in waterproofing boats, binding bricks, and even mummification in Egypt. Sulfur, too, is part of this chemical cocktail. The brittle, yellow mineral appears in veins and crusts, especially in areas of past geothermal activity. To people living here in antiquity, the association between this valley and sulfur would have been obvious. The very ground could reek of it. In some places the soil effervesced, the water bubbled with unseen gases. Fire, brimstone, bitumen, and salt were not abstract images. They were daily realities underfoot. Beneath this toxic chemistry lies the restless machinery of the earth. The Dead Sea Transform, the tectonic fault system that carved this valley, is still active. Earthquakes are a regular feature of the region's history. Ancient writers mention cities toppled and walls cracked. Archaeological layers from multiple sites around the basin show signs of sudden, violent shaking. Collapsed buildings, tilted foundations, broken pottery trapped in debris. When an earthquake runs through a landscape built of soft sediments, salt deposits, and pressurized fluids, strange things can happen. Sediment layers can liquefy and slump. Faults can open and close. Gas pockets can shift. Hydrocarbons trapped in deeper strata, natural gas, lighter fractions of petroleum, may find new pathways upward. In a basin already rich in bitumen and underlain by complex geology, it's not hard to imagine how tectonic movement could occasionally trigger surface phenomena that look, to human eyes, like the Earth attacking itself. This is where one of the more terrestrial theories about Sodom and Gomorrah comes into play. Long before cosmic airbursts entered the conversation, some researchers propose that the destruction traditions might have roots in a more local phenomenon. The ignition of natural gas or hydrocarbon-rich vapors released during an earthquake. In this model, a seismic event fractures the ground, vents flammable gases, and perhaps destabilizes pools of bitumen. A spark from a lamp, a cooking fire, friction, or even static discharge in a dust-laden atmosphere could set off a chain reaction. Fires fueled by gas and petroleum behave differently from ordinary house fires. They can spread along invisible pathways, erupt from the ground, leap across open spaces. In a valley already populated with kiln fires, oil stores, and wooden beams soaked in resins, the result could be catastrophic. Sudden pillars of flame, rolling tongues of fire feeding on vapors you cannot see. To a Bronze Age witness, watching flames race along the ground and leap skyward amid the roar of an earthquake, the language of fire and brimstone would not be poetry. It would be description. Whether or not such an event ever occurred at the scale imagined in later stories, the ingredients are undeniably here. Tectonic strain, combustible materials, and a basin designed to trap everything that runs into it. Yet despite the hazards, people lived here. Not just a few scattered huts, but substantial cities and fortified towns ringed the valley in antiquity. Why? Because destruction and abundance are two faces of the same geography. The Jordan Valley forms a corridor of life through otherwise dry highlands. Snowmelt from distant mountains and seasonal rains funnel into the river, nourishing a green ribbon of vegetation. In the Bronze Age, the lower Jordan Plain, the Kikar, was, by many reconstructions, a lush, irrigated zone. Soils enriched by periodic flooding promised high agricultural yields. Dates, grains, and grapes could flourish. Trade routes threading north and south, east and west, converged here, turning the valley into a crossroads. Settlements rose where water, arable land, and trade intersected. Tall El Hammam on the eastern side is one example. Other tells and ruin mounds around the basin hint at an archipelago of city-states and villages, each staking a claim on some patch of fertile ground between the harsh cliffs and the encroaching salt flats. But the same forces that created this wealth also set the stage for ruin. If water levels rose or fell, fields could be drowned or salinized. If the Dead Sea encroached, low-lying areas might be submerged. If earthquakes shifted the basin floor, shorelines could move, harbours could disappear. Over centuries, the coastline of the Dead Sea has not been static. It has crept and retreated, leaving behind terraces, drowned terraces, and enigmatic formations now underwater. This shifting boundary has inspired another line of inquiry, the search for lost, submerged settlements beneath the Dead Sea itself. Modern sonar surveys and underwater explorations are challenging here. The water is extraordinarily dense and corrosive. Visibility can be poor. But some efforts have mapped terraces and irregularities on the lake bed that suggest ancient shorelines, and in a few cases features that may be interpreted as man-made structures, rectilinear patterns, rubble-like mounds, now resting below the surface. These hints are tentative. The Dead Sea is not an easy place to do underwater archaeology, yet the possibility lingers that some communities which once sat along the ancient shoreline now lie drowned in brine, their foundations entombed in salt and sediment. If such sites are ever conclusively identified, they might offer a new angle on the stories of cities lost in a single blow, then swallowed by the landscape. Even without confirmed submerged towns, the pattern of habitation and abandonment around the basin tells a quiet tale. Periods of dense settlement are followed by stretches where the valley seems sparsely occupied or reorganized. Sometimes this aligns with broader regional shifts, climate fluctuations, political upheavals, trade collapses. Sometimes it may reflect more local events, salinization of fields, shoreline changes, or disasters we can only infer from debris and silence. Over time, people watching this valley must have noticed its instability. They saw fields turn barren. They smelled sulphur on the wind. They watched fogs rise from the water and heard the deep, unsettling groans of the earth during quakes. They saw cliffs crumble, tar float, and perhaps, now and then, fires behave in ways that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In such a place, it is not a stretch to imagine a moral geography forming. Highlands become associated with safety, with refuge. The deep basin, with its choking air and ghostly haze, becomes the realm where God, or the gods, have done terrible things before, and might do so again. Stories cluster here, of cities overturned, of plains cursed, of pillars of salt that were once living eyes turned back toward forbidden sight. When later scribes and storytellers reached for a landscape to stage a lesson about judgment, about the danger of corruption and the suddenness of catastrophe, they didn't have to invent a setting from nothing. They could point to a real valley already heavy with chemical fire, tectonic scars, and abandoned ruins, a place where the earth itself seems unstable, where the boundary between land and water, life and desolation, is always shifting. The Dead Sea region is, in that sense, not just a backdrop but a character in the story, a landscape that naturally lends itself to tales of divine wrath because its very geology speaks in the language of rupture, burning, and salt. And while the Bible anchors that language in one particular tradition, it is not alone. Other cultures, looking at their own volatile skies and treacherous ground, told their own stories of fire from above and worlds undone. To trace those echoes, we have to step beyond the Jordan Valley and listen to what the wider ancient world remembered about flames falling from heaven. Other civilizations, watching their own skies and trembling at their own earthquakes, reached for the same language, fire from heaven, cities erased in an instant, gods who judge with light. Across the Sinai and down the Nile, Egyptian scribes were carving history onto stone. Egypt, unlike the Dead Sea basin, looked stable. The Nile rose and fell in a predictable rhythm. Its floods were the heartbeat of the kingdom, yet even here, the sense that the world could suddenly tilt out of balance was never far away. Some of the Middle Kingdom pessimistic literature, like the admonitions of Ippur, paints a picture of social and environmental collapse. The river turned to blood, crops failing, cities in turmoil. The text is poetic and exaggerated, not a simple chronicle, but it shows how Egyptians imagined catastrophe, chaos breaking through the ordered world of Maat. Other records hint more directly at violent, fiery events. New Kingdom inscriptions sometimes speak of enemy towns, burned as if by the fire of Re, the sun god. In battle scenes, cities are shown engulfed in stylized flames, descending almost vertically, as if the sky itself is attacked. When the Egyptians described volcanic eruptions in the distant Aegean, they used similar language: ash darkening the sun, distant lands consumed by the wrath of gods. There are also late Egyptian tales where meteors and strange celestial objects are woven into omen lists, stars that fall, lights that blaze across the firmament and bring ill fortune. To a people who watched the regular path of the sun and stars with almost obsessive care, anything that broke that order would have felt like a wound in the sky. Whether these texts record specific events or symbolic fears, the pattern is familiar. When destruction comes suddenly and completely, the most natural metaphor is that the very light of heaven has turned against you. Further north and west among the Greeks, that metaphor becomes a full-blown myth. One of the most evocative is the story of Phaethon. Phaethon, son of Helios, begs to drive his father's sun chariot for a day. Against his better judgment, Helios agrees. The young driver cannot control the horses. The chariot veers too high, freezing the earth, then dives too low, scorching it. Rivers boil, forests ignite, whole regions burn. To save the world, Zeus hurls a thunderbolt, knocking Phaethon from the sky. The youth falls, flaming into the river Eridanus. His sisters weep until they turn into trees, their tears hardening into amber. Ancient commentators sometimes treated this as a memory of a cosmic event, a comet, a falling star, a terrible heat wave. Modern scholars usually file it under cosmic allegory, yet its details are striking. The sky misbehaves, heat descends, the earth burns in patches, not uniformly, and the catastrophe ends with a single, blinding stroke from above. Elsewhere in Greek myth, Zeus wields thunderbolts as precision weapons against cities. When he destroys the city of Salmoneus for imitating divine thunder, he does it with real lightning. When impious kings defy the gods, they are struck down by the thunderbolt. In some local traditions, ruined sites were pointed out as places burned by Zeus, their shattered stones quietly reinforcing the story. These are not neutral descriptions of weather. They are attempts to explain why a particular place is broken, why a particular people vanished, in terms that make sense within a world ruled by capricious deities. If you travel still farther east, into the deep textual forests of ancient India, the imagery becomes even more elaborate. In the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, composed over many centuries and layered with later interpretation, we encounter weapons that seem to belong as much to the heavens as to the battlefield. There is the astra, celestial weapon, granted by a god and invoked by mantras. Some astra are described in language that, to modern ears, sounds unnervingly like explosions from above. One famous passage, often quoted and just as often overinterpreted, speaks of a weapon that blazed like the fire of 1,000 suns, reducing warriors and chariots to ash, with birds falling from the sky and waters boiling. Most scholars read these as highly stylized poetic devices, the product of an extremely rich metaphorical tradition. But their narrative role is clear. These are not ordinary spears or arrows. They bridge earth and sky, bringing down focused, devastating fire that can annihilate not just armies, but entire cities. The epics also remember cities that vanish almost overnight. In some tellings, the city of Dvaraka, beloved of Krishna, sinks beneath the sea after his departure, its towers swallowed by the waves. Others speak of fortresses reduced to rubble by God-given weapons, leaving a landscape of glassy stones and scorched earth. Whether or not any real disaster lies behind these stories, the pattern echoes the Near Eastern traditions: sudden erasure, followed by a moral explanation. A weapon from heaven, wielded by or with the permission of the divine, becomes the hinge between prosperity and desolation. Back along the eastern Mediterranean coast, on the shorelines once controlled by the Phoenicians and other Canaanite peoples, the boundary between mythic fire and remembered cities grows even thinner. Ugaritic texts from late Bronze Age Syria, written in a language closely related to biblical Hebrew, praise the storm god Baal as rider on the clouds. His weapons are thunder and lightning. In one cycle he defeats the sea god Yam with bolts that flash like spears. When Baal fights, the earth shakes, mountains tremble, and his enemies' strongholds are shattered. In some ritual texts, there are curses calling for a city that breaks covenant to be destroyed by fire from Baal's hand, or for its fields to become salt and desolation. The imagery overlaps uncannily with later biblical descriptions of ruined plains and salted ground. The Phoenicians, heirs to this Canaanite world, carried such stories with them as they established colonies around the Mediterranean. Greek writers, hearing about foreign gods who command lightning and overthrow cities, often translated them directly into their own terms. Baal became Zeus, Melkart became Heracles, and the original local memories blurred into a shared vocabulary of divine fire and fallen towns. When you line these traditions up side by side, Egyptian laments, Greek myths, Indian epics, Canaanite hymns, it is tempting to see them as fragments of the same event. Perhaps some suggest a truly large cosmic airburst, or a cluster of impacts scattered destruction over a wide region. Different cultures, struck at different points, might preserve their own tales of a day when the sky itself attacked. It is a possibility, but a difficult one to prove. Most of the texts we have were written down centuries, even millennia, after the periods they describe. Their timelines are elastic, their geography is mythic as much as literal, and the physical evidence for any single, synchronous, global-scale disaster of this sort in the Bronze Age or earlier is at best controversial. There is another, simpler explanation. Natural disasters are common. Human beings are storytellers. When an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, a meteor, or a massive storm strikes a settled community, the experience is intensely similar across cultures. The ground moves, the sky changes, light and fire appear where they should not. Terror is followed by silence, ruins, and questions. In that silence, people reach for meaning. They look at a burned-out city and ask not only how, but why. Why here? Why now? Why us, and not them? The easiest way to answer is to say that the disaster was not random. It was a message. If your gods are storm gods, the message comes with thunderbolts. If your highest deity is the sun, it comes with blinding radiance. If your religious imagination is steeped in notions of cosmic law and moral order, the fire becomes a kind of verdict. Over generations, storytellers refine that verdict. They attach it to particular sins, particular cities, particular kings. They add details, motifs, speeches, bargains with heaven. They fold in other memories of wars, plagues, migrations, until a single sharp disaster becomes part of a larger moral landscape. And the result is that broadly similar natural events, earthquakes, impacts, eruptions, filtered through different religious and cultural lenses, generate stories that rhyme with one another. A chariot of the sun that falls and burns the earth, a city turned to salt, a weapon that blazes like 1,000 suns, a storm god who rains fire, a valley where bitumen burns and sulphur falls. When multiple cultures tell stories like these, we stand at a crossroads of interpretation, One path says, these are independent creations, testimony not to a single historical event, but to a shared human psychology. Another path says, beneath the metaphors lies a real scar, left by something unusual enough to be remembered far and wide, then retold in local dialects of myth. We may never fully separate those paths, but by listening carefully to the echoes, by noticing where the stories converge and where they diverge, we can begin to understand not only what might have happened in the skies and on the ground, but what it meant to the people who survived and to those who came after, trying to make sense of broken stones and burned horizons. And that brings us back, quietly, to the realm of scholars and skeptics, believers and doubters, all sifting through the same fragments, asking how far these echoes can really be pushed before they fade into coincidence. In the modern world, those echoes do not fall silent. They turn into arguments, not the shouting match kind, more often the slow, careful kind that plays out in journal articles, conference halls, and quietly annotated books. At the centre of that conversation sits a deceptively simple question. Did Sodom and Gomorrah ever exist as real cities that died in real fire? For many mainstream archaeologists and biblical scholars, the cautious answer is no, or at least not in the way people usually imagine. From this perspective, the story in Genesis is not a field report. It is a theological narrative, shaped and reshaped over centuries to communicate a moral point, that injustice, violence and arrogance lead to destruction, that hospitality matters, that divine justice, however mysterious, ultimately prevails. These scholars point out that the text itself is sparse on practical details. There are almost no dates. The geography, though anchored by the plain of the Jordan and the Dead Sea, is painted in broad strokes. By the time the story reached the form we know, the original historical kernel, if there ever was one, may have been diluted, expanded, or even replaced. Some go further and argue that Sodom and Gomorrah were never meant to be located on a map at all. In this reading, they function more like the city of fools or wicked town in later folklore, a place where everything that can go wrong, morally speaking, does. The city becomes a stage set onto which all the anxieties of a community are projected. Sexual transgression, abuse of guests, contempt for the poor, defiance of the divine. The fire from heaven in this view is the punchline of a parable. It ties the moral bow neatly. What matters is not what kind of fire it was, or where it fell, but what the story says about how a community should live. On the other side of the spectrum are those who insist that the story must rest on something concrete. They point to the way Genesis clusters Sodom and Gomorrah with other named towns, Admah, Zeboim, Zoar, as if they belong to a real political landscape. They note that later biblical texts speak of the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, as if recalling a remembered catastrophe. They compare this with how other cultures anchored their own destruction myths to specific places. For these readers, the story is not just a moral warning, but a blurred memory of an event that left a physical scar. That is where the debate over Tall El Hammam enters, carrying both promise and controversy. Tall El Hammam is a large archaeological site northeast of the Dead Sea in the modern Jordan Valley. For over a decade, a team led by Stephen Collins and colleagues has argued that this mound, with its impressive Bronze Age city and sudden destruction layer, is the best candidate yet for the historical Sodom. Their case rests on several pillars. Geographically, Tall El Hammam sits in the right general region, the fertile lower Jordan plain, within sight of the Dead Sea. Chronologically, its major city flourished in the Middle Bronze Age, and then seems to have been abruptly abandoned for centuries. Archaeologically, the destruction layer shows unusual signs: melted pottery, high-temperature effects on mud brick, odd distributions of debris. To proponents, this lines up strikingly with a sudden, intense, city-wide disaster. When they combine this with the proposed evidence for a cosmic airburst, microscopic spherules, shocked quartz, strange chemical signatures, they suggest a dramatic scene. A low-altitude explosion of a space rock over the valley, flattening buildings, igniting organic material, and salting the fields with toxic residues. In that light, the biblical description of a plane that smokes like a furnace, of fire and brimstone raining from the sky, begins to look less like pure imagination and more like a poetic compression of a real event. But many archaeologists remain unconvinced. Some question the identification of Tal el-Hammam with Sodom on textual grounds. They note that the biblical traditions seem to place the cities of the plain closer to the southern end of the Dead Sea. Other proposed sites like Bab Edadra and Umera, with their own Bronze Age destruction layers on the southeastern shore, have long been in the running. There is no scholarly consensus on which cluster, if any, matches the biblical picture. Others focus on methodology. They argue that starting with the Bible and then scouring the landscape for a site that fits risks confirmation bias. If you look long enough, they say, you can always find a mound with a dramatic destruction, and then tailor your interpretation to match the story. In their view, archaeology should work the other way around. Build a reconstruction from the ground up, and only then ask whether any texts plausibly intersect with it. Then there is the airburst theory itself. Critics point out that many of the claimed markers, melted surfaces, high-temperature effects, unusual geochemistry, can, under certain conditions, be produced by more ordinary processes, intense fires, kilns, industrial activities, or complex taphonomic histories. They question sampling procedures, laboratory methods, and statistical interpretations. Some specialists in impact geology argue that the evidence does not yet meet the rigorous standards used to confirm other airburst events. They warn against rushing to cosmic explanations when terrestrial ones might suffice. In response, the proponents of the airburst model refine their data, run more tests, and publish additional analyses. They highlight patterns they believe are hard to explain without a high-energy event from above. The distribution of material damage, the estimated temperatures, the regional ecological collapse that seems to follow. They compare Tal el-Hammam to known airburst events like Tunguska and Chelyabinsk, and to other proposed prehistoric impacts. Back and forth the debate goes. Claims, counterclaims, replies, rejoinders. Behind these technical arguments lies a deeper difference in how various communities approach the question. For many religious believers, the possibility of a real Sodom, however dimly seen through the dust of time, is emotionally and spiritually significant. It seems to root the text in history, to show that at least some biblical narratives grew from actual events. For them, scientific evidence of a cosmic blast does not threaten faith. It illustrates the means through which divine judgment might operate in a law-governed universe. Others within religious traditions are far more comfortable letting Sodom be primarily a story. For them, the power of the narrative lies not in stones and ash, but in what it demands ethically: justice, compassion, humility. Whether or not archaeologists ever agree on a site, the moral weight of the tale remains. On the scientific side, many researchers bracket the theological questions entirely. They study destruction layers, impact markers, and settlement patterns without any need to draw lines to Genesis. If the evidence points to an airburst, so be it. If not, that is fine too. The Bible in this framework becomes one ancient voice among many, a late and layered witness that must be handled with the same caution as any mythic tradition. Threaded through all of this is a fundamental problem. Ancient texts are not designed to do what modern historians want them to do. They compress centuries into paragraphs. They freely blend metaphor and memory. They choose events not for their uniqueness, but for their narrative and theological resonance. They are as interested in meaning as in fact, often more so. Trying to prove a specific historical event from such texts is like trying to reconstruct a shattered vase from a painting of a potter's workshop. You may get hints of shape and purpose, but the exact contours remain elusive. Even when archaeology and text seem to line up, a destroyed city here, a tale of fiery judgment there, uncertainties linger. Were the stories written close in time to the event or centuries later? Did they preserve local oral traditions or borrow motifs from far away? Are we seeing direct memory or a tapestry woven from many threads? With the evidence we have now, some things can be said with modest confidence. We know that multiple cities around the Dead Sea region were violently destroyed in the Bronze Age. We know that the landscape is geologically volatile, rich in bitumen, sulfur and salt, prone to earthquakes and, possibly, vulnerable to rare cosmic events. We know that ancient peoples in this region and beyond told stories of sudden fire from heaven, of plains laid waste, of cities turned to desolation. We also know what we do not know. We cannot point to a single ruin and say, beyond serious doubt, this is Sodom. We cannot yet demonstrate that a particular cosmic airburst over the Dead Sea inspired the specific narrative in Genesis. We cannot peel back the layers of redaction and oral transmission to see the original story as it was first told beside some smoking ruin. Between these poles, what we can see in the ground and what we can only glimpse in texts stretches a wide shadowed space. It is in that space that skeptics and believers, scientists and theologians continue their slow conversation. Not to win, in the simple sense, but to refine the questions. Because in the end, the value of this debate may not lie in finally pinning Sodom to a particular set of GPS coordinates, or in definitively proving an airburst or dismissing it. It may lie in learning how to read the past with both humility and imagination. To let physical evidence and ancient stories speak to one another without forcing them to agree. To accept that some fires leave scars we can still measure, and others burn mainly in the realm of meaning. From that meeting point, we can turn back to the Sumerian tablets, the king lists, the star maps, and the laments, and ask once more what they are really telling us, not just about fire that falls from the sky, but about how fragile cities remember and how their memories survive in clay and scripture long after the smoke has blown away. When we lay all the Sumerian evidence side by side, the king lists, the star maps, the flood epics, the city laments, a tempting picture begins to form. It looks neat, almost too neat. On one side, we have Genesis with its cities of the plain and fire from heaven. On the other, we have Mesopotamian tablets speaking of cities destroyed, skies disturbed, gods unleashing burning storms. In between lies a region where people, goods, and ideas moved constantly for thousands of years. It is easy to connect the dots into a single sharp line. But history rarely gives us sharp lines. More often it gives us threads, crossed, frayed, knotted together in ways we can't fully untangle. The Sumerian tablets are threads like that. Powerful, suggestive, but not as straightforward as we might wish. The first thing they tell us is that the ancient Near East was not a collection of isolated cultures inventing stories in sealed rooms. It was a network. From the very beginning of writing in southern Mesopotamia, we see evidence of long-distance contact. Trade routes carrying timber and metals from distant mountains, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, shells from the Gulf. Cylinder seals show foreign dress. Loanwords creep from language to language. King lists casually record rulers from cities hundreds of miles apart, as if the scribes took it for granted that their audience would recognize these distant powers. Stories travelled along those same routes. We know this because motifs and plot structures appear, disappear, and reappear in different cities and different languages. Sumerian, Akkadian, Amorite, later Babylonian and Assyrian, flood narratives, divine councils, omens in the sky, cities overturned by gods. It is the same basic toolkit, rearranged and reinterpreted over centuries. By the first millennium BCE, when many biblical texts were taking shape or being edited into their final forms, the Hebrew scribes were living in this same interconnected world. Especially during and after the Babylonian exile, they were directly exposed to Mesopotamian literature and scholarship. Some may have sat in the same sorts of tablet-filled rooms where epics and omen collections were copied and recited. Did they have access to older Sumerian traditions? Almost certainly, at least indirectly. Not necessarily by pulling a 2,000-year-old clay tablet off a shelf and reading the cuneiform themselves, but through the living scholarly culture of Mesopotamia, which preserved, translated, and reworked Sumerian compositions into later Akkadian forms. Texts like the Atrahasis epic and the various flood stories were part of that ongoing tradition, copied and recopied long after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language. In that sense, the question isn't simply, did the Hebrews borrow from Sumerians? Time had already done the borrowing. By the time Genesis was compiled, Sumerian ideas had been filtered through centuries of Akkadian and Babylonian thought. This makes the direction of influence hard to pin down in any one instance. For flood stories, the dating is lopsided. The earliest Mesopotamian flood counts on tablet are more than 1,000 years older than the oldest written forms of Genesis. That doesn't prove a direct line of dependence, but it strongly suggests that the flood in the Bible is entering a conversation that Mesopotamia had been having for a very long time. With Sodom and Gomorrah, the situation is murkier. We do have Mesopotamian texts that speak of cities destroyed by divine wrath, the curse of Agade, the lamentations over Ur, Nippur and Eridu, where burning storms and overwhelming forces from the gods level urban life. We have omen texts linking unusual celestial events to the fall of kings and the ruin of towns. We have, possibly, the so-called planisphere tablet, interpreted by some as a record of a catastrophic object in the sky. But none of these texts names Sodom. None clearly describes twin cities by a salty inland sea. The parallels are thematic rather than specific. Cities overturned, moral or ritual failure, destruction from above. So the most cautious way to phrase it is this: the environment of ideas in which the Sodom story emerged was already saturated with tales of God-sent devastation. Some of those tales were Sumerian in origin. The Hebrew scribes, writing centuries later, were not inventing in a vacuum. They were reworking themes that had long been part of the region's imaginative landscape. The planisphere tablet adds another layer, not because it proves a particular impact event, but because it shows us something about how carefully early Mesopotamian observers watched the sky. Whatever the exact content of that tablet, and scholars still argue about it, it belongs to a broader tradition of astronomical and astrological records. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Babylonian skywatchers were cataloguing planets, eclipses, odd appearances of bright objects. They link these to omens for kings and kingdoms, recording patterns over generations. This undercuts one easy assumption, that all talk of fire from heaven must be purely metaphorical or purely random. People in this world were systematically looking up. They were keeping track. They knew comets, meteors, and strange luminaries existed. When something unusual appeared, they wrote it down and tried to understand what it meant. That doesn't mean every fiery narrative in later texts corresponds to a specific, datable, astronomical event. It does mean that some stories may be shaped by real memories of the sky behaving in frightening ways. At the same time, we need to recognize the limits of what clay can tell us across 4,000 years. Most tablets are broken. Many are unprovenanced, ripped from their archaeological context by early looters. Even those found in good stratigraphic layers rarely come with clear labels. This tablet refers to that event on that date. We're reconstructing from fragments, often with large gaps. Languages shift. Sumerian itself is complex and not fully understood. Akkadian, though better known, carries idioms and technical terms that resist easy translation. Scholars can debate for decades over the meaning of a single phrase, burning cloud, flaming rain, weapon of the god, without reaching consensus. Genre complicates things further. A king list is not the same as a chronicle. A lament is not a news report. An omen series is not a weatherlog. Each has its own conventions, exaggerations, and symbolic language. When a text says a city was destroyed utterly, that might mean it was abandoned for a century, or lost its elite class, or suffered a particularly traumatic sack. The rhetoric of total annihilation was a literary tool as much as a description. So when we place Sumerian and Akkadian tablets next to the biblical narrative and look for matches, we must do so with a double awareness. On one side, there is the real possibility of common memories, floods, fires, earthquakes, maybe even rare cosmic events, retold from city to city and century to century, reshaped into stories of gods and judgments. On the other, there is the equally real possibility that we are overlaying patterns that the ancient writers themselves never intended, pulled along by our own desire for coherence. Yet, even with all these cautions, there is something quietly astonishing about the tablets themselves. They should not exist. Clay is fragile. Archives burn, rivers flood, conquerors smash and reuse bricks. And still, thousands of these little rectangles of dried mud have endured, hidden in palace walls, buried in temple storerooms, forgotten in collapsed houses. When you read a translation of a Sumerian lament over a ruined city, or an omen about a blazing star that presages disaster, you are hearing a voice that somehow slipped through every crack of history's floorboards. Not perfectly, not without distortion, but audibly enough that we can still catch its tone. What those voices tell us more than anything is that ancient people were doing what we do, looking at a dangerous world and trying to make sense of sudden loss. Sometimes they did that by composing long, intricate epics. Sometimes by jotting a few lines on a tablet about a strange light in the sky. Sometimes by listing kings and marking, in a terse phrase, the city was destroyed. Centuries later, Hebrew writers stood in the same tradition. They too shaped memories of catastrophe into stories of meaning, stories like the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. Whether or not any particular Mesopotamian tablet lies behind that narrative, they share a common human project, to bind disaster and morality, chance and purpose, into something that can be told around a fire. In that sense, the Sumerian records do not so much confirm or deny the Bible as stand alongside it. Another archive of fear and wonder. Another record of cities that rose, burned, and fell. Another reminder that long before we argued about dates and impact craters, people were already trying to read the sky, the ground, and their own hearts for signs of what it all meant. From here, we can zoom out even further, to ask how often myth and history brush past each other, how stories of fire and flood can preserve a distorted memory of real events, and how, even in distortion, they can still tell us something important about the world and about ourselves. Human history has a way of hiding in stories we once thought were pure imagination. For a long time, Troy lived there, on the shelf marked myth, beside gods and heroes and impossible wars. The Iliad was poetry, not evidence. The city of Priam and Hector was a literary stage, not a place on a map. Then archaeologists began digging at Hisarlik, in northwestern Turkey. Layer after layer of settlement emerged, fortifications, burn levels, traces of a wealthy city that had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. No single layer screamed Achilles was here, but the broad outline shifted. What had seemed like a purely legendary war now looked like a stylized echo of very real late Bronze Age conflicts. Myth had not become history, but it had turned out to be history-shaped. We see this pattern elsewhere. The legendary flood that reset the world. Later we find thick flood deposits at ancient cities. Tales of a great sea swallowed by land. Later we uncover evidence of catastrophic tsunamis. Stories of wandering peoples. Later we trace genetic and linguistic footprints that show real migrations. Not every story gets vindicated by a trench and a radiocarbon date. Many never will. But again and again archaeology nudges a handful of tales from the realm of never happened into something like this probably did. The Sodom and Gomorrah tradition may belong to that same blurry category. Whether or not Tall El Hammam turns out to be one of the cities in question, the region around the Dead Sea is a geological and archaeological crossroads. Earthquakes, brine eruptions, sudden subsidence, occasional meteor traces, they all leave impressions on the landscape and on the people who live there. Over generations, those impressions turn into narrative. This is what humans do with catastrophe. We don't just remember that it hurt. We try to explain why it happened and what it means. A city burns. In one version, it is an accident of weather and stone. In another, it is a god's decision. The flames are the same. The framing is different. In Mesopotamia, a failed harvest could be recorded in an administrative tablet as short rations assigned, and in a lament as Enlil removed abundance from the land. The same drought wears two masks, one logistical, one theological. Disasters are especially good at attracting moral explanations. When everything collapses without warning, famine, plague, invasion, fire from the sky, people look backward for signs. Surely there must have been a broken oath, an insult to a deity, an injustice unpunished. The randomness of the event feels intolerable. To live with it, we weave it into a moral pattern. That pattern takes different forms in different cultures. In Sumer, a city might be punished for neglecting a temple ritual. In later Israel, for violence, arrogance, and lack of hospitality. In other traditions, gods might destroy cities for hubris, impiety, or simply being on the wrong side of a cosmic dispute. The details vary. The structure repeats. At the center is a simple equation. If something this terrible happened, it must have been for a reason. This is why stories of divine fire, divine flood, divine wind turn up almost everywhere we look. In Mesopotamia, in ancient Greece, in India, in Mesoamerica, in the Pacific. People see lightning strike a tree, a volcano blacken the sky, a meteor streak low enough to rattle the ground, and they slot it into a worldview where weather and will are intertwined. When you live in a world without seismology or impact modelling, the sky is not an impersonal dome of physics. It is a realm of persons. Anything that comes from it, especially if it is bright, loud, and deadly, belongs to that realm. Even today, when an earthquake devastates a region, or a hurricane destroys a town, you still hear people reach instinctively for purpose, judgment, warning, test, wake-up call. The scientific explanation and the moral explanation sit side by side. One says, how? The other tries to say, why? The Sumerians were doing the same thing in their own register, tracking eclipses, comets, and meteors with painstaking care, and then reading those events as omens for kings and cities. Hebrews centuries later were doing it with their own vocabulary of covenant, sin, and righteousness. If there really was a cosmic airburst over the Dead Sea Plain, or a chain of earthquakes and explosions that tore through those settlements, it would be entirely in character for the survivors and their descendants to tell the story as an encounter with the divine. Not because they were gullible, but because that was their most powerful way of making sense of trauma. Archaeology's role in this isn't to strip away all meaning. leaving only a bare timeline of impacts and collapses. It is to see how the physical events and the narrative responses interlock. That work is still very much in progress. At Tall El Hammam and neighbouring sites, teams continue to sift through collapsed walls and ash layers, looking for more tiny clues. Melted minerals, pottery with strange vitrified glazes, unusual distributions of bones, signs of sudden abandonment rather than gradual decline. Specialists test samples for traces of high temperature, high pressure events that might distinguish a cosmic airburst from a conventional fire or earthquake. Elsewhere around the Dead Sea, surveys map ancient shorelines, fault lines, and old settlement patterns. Ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing quietly search for buried structures that might rewrite the map of Bronze Age cities. Each season adds a few more data points, a few more puzzle pieces. None of this guarantees a neat answer. It does mean that the story is not frozen. New evidence can still surface. Old assumptions can still be overturned. We have seen that happen before. A century ago, Near Eastern